Welcome to the Aboriginal channel. On this episode, we're going to learn about the institution of white slavery in the Americas. We're going to do that by going through some books and making some correlations. Starting with this old book from 1671 called America, being the latest and most accurate description of the New World, containing the original of the inhabitants. So in the beginning of the book, there's this image right here. It says America. In 1671, I don't believe the 13 colonies were complete yet. So before the colonies were completed, there was an America. Right here in this image, you have a Aboriginal queen being held by two European or white slaves. Around her, you have other Aboriginals, and then you have other Europeans that don't look like slaves. Now, inside the book, it talks about the white slave system. So right here it's talking about how the Europeans brought slaves, English slaves, to the Americas. It says the Lord's propriety of this country for the better settlement of it according to their patent granted upon them by his majesty, and for the enlargement of the king's dominions in those parts of America. He's talking about Carolina. Right here it says Carolina granted by patent to several noble persons by his majesty. It goes on to say, have been at great charge to secure this so rich and advantage a country to the crown of England, to whom an ancient right by the discovery of Sir Sebastian Cabot in the time of Henry VII, it doeth belong, and for its situation, fertility, neighborhood to our other plantations and several other conveniences of too valuable consideration to be negligently lost. By the care, therefore, and endeavors of those great men, it has now two considerable colonies planted in it. The one of Albemarle on the north side, bordering on Virginia, where are some hundreds of English families removed there from New England. English families removed there from New England. English families removed there from New England. And some of our other plantations in the West Indies, and another towards the middle of the country at Charlestown or Ashley River, a settlement so hopeful for the healthiness of the land and convenience of access by a large, deep, navigatable river, and so promising in its very infancy that many of the rich inhabitants of Barbados and Bermudas, who are now crowded up in those flourishing islands, and many in our other American plantations, are turning their eyes and thoughts this way, and have already removed part of their stock and servants there. Remove part of their stock and servants there. So they would remove their servants. They also said some hundreds of English families were removed from New England and some from the West Indies to be placed in the Carolinas. So the old book is already talking about white slavery. In another book called White Cargo, it's talking about white slaveries in the Americas. But in this particular passage right here, it's talking about how the English were colonizing and enslaving white people in Europe prior to coming to the Americas. It's talking about the corrupt guy, Sir John Pouffam. It says this intimidating man was involved in colonialism years before the Plymouth Company was created. In the 1580s, the Queen decided to stamp out rebellion forever in Munster by confiscating the vast estates there of the Desmond family and repopulating them with English Protestants. Catholic Irish were ordered out, and the land was offered at tuppence an acre to English landlords who would undertake to plant it with tenants from England. Who would undertake to plant it with tenants from England. Pouffam was one of many who saw himself accumulating a huge Irish estate. He assembled more than 80 families and dispatched them to Munster. However, another English worthy was already off the mark and had tenanted the land, leaving Pouffam's tenants no choice but to return home. A few decades later, a not dissimilar scheme called the head right system, look that up, would be introduced in America, and the wealthy would become still richer by obtaining grants of land for importing the poor to settle the new world. For importing the poor to settle the new world. So right here is talking about how they remove and plant colonized areas with English people. In another book right here called They Were White and They Were Slaves, talking about the same thing about white people being slaves in America. Right here on page 64, it says, confronted with the labor shortage typical in early America, the colony of New York petitioned for white slaves from England. Petitioned for white slaves from England in 1693. Goes on to say the Quakers of Philadelphia also sought them. So they were looking for white slaves to inhabit the forts or colonies. Goes on to say there were 4 categories of status for white people in colonial America: white freemen who owned property, white apprentices. They were also called indentured servants, redemptioners, and free willers, which all these people ended up being slaves, and white slaves. So you had the white freemen and the white freemen who owned white slaves. But they petitioned for white slaves from England in 1693. Now, here's another passage from that same book where it's talking about how they were enslaving their own kind in their own land. It says, this was labor without any breaks, unceasing labor. When the children fell asleep at the machines, they were lashed into wakefulness with a whip alternately known as a thong or strap. If they arrived late in the factory, talked to another child, or committed some other infraction, they were beaten with an iron bar known as a billy roller. A contemporary witness described the factory children of Manchester, England, as almost universally ill-looking, small, sickly, barefoot, and ill-clad. In the room they entered, the dirty, ragged, miserable crew were all active in the performance of their various tasks, the overlookers, strap in hand, on the alert, the whirling spindles urging the little slaves who waited on them to movements as unceasing as their own. So they were moving as fast as the whirling spindles were. It says the essential feature of factory life as it developed in England was that the children were enslaved. Here's another passage from the book They Were White and They Were Slaves. It's talking about how they were using kids as human brooms in England. It says the poor white children were a very expendable commodity in Gregorian and Victorian England, as this period print of an actual chimney sweeping accident illustrates. Enslaved to a master of chimney sweeps from as young as the age of 4, white boys were forced to climb inside suffocating and cramped flues and clean them. They received no pay, begged their food, and slept in cellars. Many died from accidents, beatings, and cancer brought on from constant contact with ash and cinder, which they had no opportunity to wash from their skin. In the illustration above, 2 climbing boys have been crushed and suffocated after the collapse of the chimney's masonry. The man on the right with the pick is a builder who has been summoned to extricate the children. One lies dead on the floor, bottom left, mourned perhaps by a servant of the house, since these white slaves were almost all orphans or the kidnapped children of paupers. The other boy remains stuck in the flue. His master is attempting to pull him from the rubble by his foot and leg as the lady of the house looks on. Thousands of white children slaved as sweeps. The British House of Lords repeatedly refused to outlaw the use of white children under the age of 10 or reform the trade in any way. The Lords contended that to do so would interfere with property rights. Going back to the old book, it's talking about how the land of Carolina, they're comparing it to Bermuda and Barbados. But this is what they're saying. It says, and generally all the English planting in the West Indies are so taken with the conveniences of this country, which, as some of the most considerable of the English in those parts say of it, promises all that the heart of man can wish, that they send the overplus of their people here. To which the inhabitants of Barbados, a skillful and weary sort of planters, well knowing in all parts of the West Indies, have been found to remove the hands they could spare. So it's saying they send their overplus people to Carolina as they do in Barbados. When we go over to a book called White Cargo, right here in the book White Cargo, it's talking about the enslaved English folks or European folks in Barbados. It says Ireland, with its ready supply of young men with little adequate employment, became a labor exchange for the Barbados sugar industry. Although Scottish youths were in even more demand, the need for labor on Barbados outstripped supply from the British Isles. In 1646, the government published a memorandum to encourage the trade in servants. And in 1652, an act was passed allowing two or more justices to issue a warrant for vagrants and beggars to be shipped to the colonies whether to island colonies or America. Due to the political turmoil of the 17th century, many Irish and Scots were banished to Barbados for political or religious reasons. Goes on to say that if they could only get through their 7 years or so of labor, they hoped, then work might set them free, if only. For them, Barbados was a penal colony. Those who worked their indentured years here were not part of a plan to create an empire through settlement. No, they were simply part of a mercantile plan to develop capitalism on the island. Their role was purely that to work and through their labor create profit. In some colonies in America, the head right system placed the bounded workforce at the center of a settlement plan. In Barbados, it made the worker a unit of production that had a monetary value. And then again in the book, They Were White and They Were Slaves, it says the crown put tens of thousands of political dissidents in slavery, some being shipped to New England while others were deported to the plantations of the West Indies and worked to death. In the island's boiler houses, mills, and sugarcane fields. Cromwell sold the white survivors of the massacre at Drogheda to slave traders in the Barbados, and thereafter it became his fixed policy to Barbados his opponents. Says by 1655, half of the total white population of Barbados consisted of political prisoners sold into slavery. Down here it says establishment historians claim that only blacks were slaves because whites were released after a term of 7 or 10 years of servitude. But the history of the enslavement of Britain's political prisoners disproves this notion. Plantation owners saw it as their profitable and patriotic duty to extend the servitude of the political prisoners on the plantations far beyond the supposed 10 or 20-year limit. Again, in the old book, America being the latest and most accurate description, it's talking about the manner of government of the Indians in Carolina. It says every little town is distinct principality, governed by a hereditary king, who in some places is not son but sister's son to the preceding king, the succession of the blood royal being continued by the safer side. The great business of those princes is to lead their men out against their enemies in war, or against the beasts in hunting. For unless it be to appoint them where to hunt, or else to consult about making some attempt upon their enemy, he has but small trouble in the government of his subjects, who either through their own honesty or the few occasions they have for controversies in their extemporary way of living, need few laws and little severity to keep them in order, but yet they govern their people without contract, and fail not of a ready obedience to their commands, so that when some of them have bought things of such of the English, who by the orders made amongst ourselves were not to traffic with the Indians. Now, he's saying that the English, it was made by an order that they were not to trade or traffic with the Indians. And in the book right here called White Cargo, it's talking about at the plantation or the fort or the colony or behind the palisade walls where the Europeans were. It says trading with the Native Americans was a capital crime. It says right here in the book White Cargo, the fugitives had headed south in an attempt to reach the Spanish-held territory 1,000 kilometers away in Florida. So these white slaves were running towards Florida, like they said the Seminoles did. But it says the High Marshal employed Native Americans to track down the fugitives and bring them back. It says Percy reported some he appointed to be hanged. So when it says he appointed them to be hanged, some burned and some to be broken upon wheels, and others to be staked and some to be shot to death. It was the Native Americans he employed to track them down who done it. And over in Barbados, again in the book White Slavery or White Cargo, says there was a final twist in the status of white and black slaves in Barbados. By the last decade of the 17th century, the Irish had become so rebellious and mistrusted by the authorities that African slaves were recruited into the very militia that had the task of putting down the slave rebellions. Africans carried arms. Africans carried arms to police both other Africans and their European colleagues in servitude. Now, they saying that they were Africans, right? But prior to that, again in the book White Cargo, in the Barbados chapter, it says the cane was to make kill devil or rum. The early planters were so optimistic that they could follow where Virginia led and form an economy based on tobacco and cotton. To help them establish such a agrarian economy, Powell brought a group of 40 Arawak tribesmen from Guyana as agricultural instructors. The Arawaks were soon betrayed and enslaved. Shortly afterwards, the enterprising planters kidnapped more Arawaks to work their fields for them. They were simply among the first of many to be betrayed and debased on the island of Barbados. So it would appear that those people that they are calling Africans are really the Arawaks. In the book, they were white and they were slaves by Michael A. Hoffman II. It says Negroes were also owned other Negroes, which was in the Charleston County probate court records from 1754 and 1758 on page 406. While whites languished in chains, blacks were free men in Virginia throughout the 17th century. Blacks were free men in Virginia throughout the 17th century. Okay, that's the 1600s. And it gives right below it the source. In 1717, it was proposed that a qualification for election to the South Carolina Assembly was to be the ownership of one white man. Again, it gives the source. And then down here it says Negroes voted in Carolina counties of Berkeley and Craven in 1706, and their votes were taken. Below that, it says blacks were toting guns. Pause. Now, earlier we read something where they said Africans in Barbados were given guns. But right here it says blacks were toting guns or other weapons and going about armed in the service of wealthy landowners at the same time that tens of thousands of enslaved white men were forbidden arms. In 1678, 1,000 Negroes were armed by the planters and formed in a fighting militia for protection against the French. It says in Carolina in 1704, 1707, 1712, 1738, and 1741, bills were passed authorizing armed Negro militias in the service of the planters. In 1742, certificates were presented to the black militiamen for services rendered. Now, in this next clip, we're going to answer the question right here of this Aboriginal woman owning these two white slaves. So right here is a clip from the same book. They were white and they were slaves. It says white slaves were actually owned by Negroes and Indians in the South to such an extent that the Virginia Assembly passed the following law in 1670. It is enacted that no Negro or Indian, though baptized and enjoyed their own freedom, shall be capable of any such purchase of Christians. Statutes of the Virginia Assembly, Volume 2, page 280, 281. So there you have it. Negroes and Indians, which were the same people, but they say it different in the text because that's the way of dominant academia. So besides that, we know that the Indian and the Negro was the same and that they owned white slaves. A testament to that is this image right here from this old book. It said that Negroes and Indians owned white slaves in America. So right here is an image of it from 1671. But let's go in the book over here. It's called White Cargo. It's talking about a young Frethorn was a servant on Martin's Hundred, 20,000 acres of forest stretching around a bend in the James River 9 or 10 miles from Jamestown. This vast tract was granted to a syndicate of London merchants led by Sir Richard Martin, who we saw in an earlier chapter haggling the House of Commons on Virginia's behalf. Somewhere between 100 and 150 settlers were on the plantation when Opikakanu warriors struck. 80 of them were killed, 20 more, all of them women, were taken off as captives. So Indians destroyed this colony that they wanted to make 10 miles away from Jamestown. It goes on to further correlate or confirm what I was saying about the colonies being forts and how they were always on guard from the Indians, that they couldn't really move how they say they were moving. But in that same book, White Cargo, it says that in 1624, a white slave appealed to the Virginia Company for her freedom, describing the 10 months she had so far served Pot as differing not from her slavery with the Indians. Then down here it says that fear of attack by the Algonquin was a constant on the plantations. As we shall see in the next chapter, a rain of arrows could cut a man down at any time. Yet large numbers of servants would opt to take their chances with the Native Americans and seek refuge with them in future years rather than stick it out on the plantations. Life in the tobacco fields could be that bad. Goes on to say right here, when they were contemplating on enslaving Indians, it says they were even fit to row in galleys. It was a widely held view, and as we have just seen from Frethorn's letter, settlers attempted to put it into practice, but mass enslavement of the native population on their own terrain was never realistic. In later years, large numbers of men and women from a range of tribes would indeed be enslaved and terribly used. But for the moment, the settlers went instead for a war of extermination. Powhatan villages were put to the fire and hundreds of Native Americans were killed in the effort to clear them all from the Chesapeake or kill them. In fact, in 1622, it was the Native Americans, not the settlers, who had taken slaves. That's what they saying, right? Which is true. But right here it says that when they were planning in Europe to come and colonize the so-called New World, it says the net was cast wide. Glass makers and winemakers were recruited from France and potash workers from Poland. Ministers of religion were on the recruitment list too. The company, the Virginia Company, the company issued instructions for Native American children to be kidnapped, so they could be made into good Protestants. And then another passage from the White Cargo book, it says, Gorges backed George Weymouth's 1605 expedition to the North Atlantic coast. Upon his return, Weymouth presented him with 5 members of the Wabanaki and Pamaquid tribes he had captured. The idea was to exhibit them around England to drum up interest in the colonial enterprise. The captives demonstrated their skill in handling a dugout canoe on the River Thames. And according to the Spanish ambassador Don Pedro de Zuniga, they were quickly taught English so they could say how good that country America is for people to go there and inhabit it. Gorges wanted Popham's help in his American ventures and presented the Lord Chief Justice with 2 of his Native Americans. Through the history books, which has all been a lie. So therefore, if it's a lie, then what's the truth? If it's a lie, then what's